Okay, so now we're going to discuss um, global imbalances, how they relate to the video that has just gone before on export-led growth and debt-led growth. We're going to discuss why these imbalances are often considered deeply problematic and what we can do about them. So this is a relatively short video, building on the video that has just gone before. In particular, I want to emphasize one suggestion that was very prominent after the Great Depression and before the establishment of a new monetary system following World War II, which is namely the Keynes plan, or the Bankole plan, or there's various names given to it, but essentially it's the plan that John Maynard Keynes devised in 1941 as his suggested way in which the monetary system, international monetary system, should function. But we'll get there in time. So let's begin with, defining global imbalances. In order to do so, let's just remind ourselves of some fundamental concepts within macroeconomic accounting. So the current account balance, here CAB, is simply the sum of net exports, net income receipts from abroad, and the net current transfers. So net exports we know very well. It's just the value of exported goods and services minus the value of imported goods and services. Perhaps less well known is the definition of these two last terms. The first one, NY, is the net income receipts from abroad. So this includes the citizens of another country or the corporations resident in another country sending incomes, profits, whatever they may be, any form of income back to our given country. And it's taken away all money that is simply transferred outside of the country. A related but slightly different term is the net current transfers, which is a much less significant, typically it's the least significant of the three, but depending on the country, it might actually be quite important, especially in developing countries. Net current transfers are usually official aid, gifts, these sorts of development funds that are transferred across borders. Okay, and let's also remind ourselves of one of the related important identities in macroeconomics, namely that the sum of consumption, saving, and taxes, so this is all the money that is that leaves the pockets of our households in any given year, must be equal to the aggregate expenditure, so the aggregate demand. Just cancelling out the C on both sides and rearranging, we find that the current account balance, as we know, is equal to the difference between saving and investment plus the difference between taxes, so tax receipts, and government expenditure. Okay, assuming purely for simplicity that the government is running a balanced budget, or it's so close that it's negligible for now, we see that the current account balance is simply equal to the difference between saving and investment. So if a country is running, it has high positive net exports and is receiving incomes from abroad greater than sending to abroad, or sending abroad, then the positive current account balance is equal to, implies that saving is greater than investment. And this must be true simply by the way these variables are measured and computed in the national statistics offices around the world. On the other hand, if investment is greater than saving, so in the case of debt-led countries, then it simply implies that, net exports must be negative, or the sum of these three terms must be negative. Typically, though, because net exports is the dominant components of the current account balance, these two terms are nearly interchangeable, although realistically they are not. Okay, so in thinking about export-led countries and debt-led countries, we already have some ramifications for the growth models that we have seen in the previous video. Export-led countries will be saving more than they are investing. Debt-led countries generally will be investing more than they are saving, and will therefore be net importers. Okay, let's look at then current account balances of some of the major economies around the world. So this is simply, well, this current account balance expressed as a percentage of world GDP. So that's just to be able to kind of compare them with other countries around the world. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is that here in purple is the United States. So as opposed to the other categories I have here, which are all kind of groups of countries, the United States stands alone because it's just such a dominant part of this macroeconomic phenomenon. So we see that the US from the 1990s has been running persistent current account deficits. So it has been importing much more than it has been exporting. Typically, it tends to receive positive net income receipts, but this does not offset the massively negative net exports. So the United States is, in some sense, being the consumer of last resort, it seems, in the world economy for the last couple of decades at least. And so some people, when they discuss the global imbalances phenomenon, they typically kind of present it as the same as being, well, why is the United States such a persistently deficit country? Because, yeah, it's basically almost saying the same thing. But of course, it's not quite the whole case. We have other countries, especially these sorts of Western European countries and Australia, which have been running persistent deficits over time. And then, of course, on the other side of the coin, if there's always a deficit country, then there must always be a surplus country or group of countries. And in particular, it's those export-led countries we mentioned in the previous video. So Germany, Japan, Netherlands, Austria, that tend to be the exporting or surplus countries. Of course, China is massively important here as well. This has been grouped with others, well, with Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia, but China is clearly the dominant, well, is the dominant one of that group. And in blue here we have the oil exporting countries, which of course run surpluses frequently, and there's no mystery as to why, simply because they have oil that a lot of other countries do not have. So the question really is, why is the United States always running these deficits? And what are the implications? Well, here are some reasons to care about global imbalances as defined on the last slide. Well, firstly, they represent a drag on the global economy. So when you have all these surpluses being accumulated by these countries, and there's no sort of tendency to decrease over time, it seems, perhaps apart from the period after the last financial crisis, but it seems pretty stubborn since, then all these surpluses are being created, and just like saving within the monetary system, they do not enter the economy or an economy again, and therefore, they're not being put to use in demanding goods and services that are created, and therefore they can slow down the growth of the global economy, or certain economies in particular. Secondly, and I guess this is usually what is kind of thought of when the issue of global imbalances come up, is the issue of stability and the issue of debt. So a fundamental question is, how long can the deficit countries, and the US in particular, run deficits before they can no longer finance this deficit? Because, of course, if you are always running a deficit, as we saw on the previous slide, it means that your investment is greater than your saving, and it means you needed finance from abroad to make that deficit even possible. Now, in the case of the US, the deficit has been financed abroad for many years, and we'll get into why exactly that is. But the question is, will the US always be able to finance its deficits without an explosive amount of debt, and therefore a massive impact on the world economy? So deficit countries always must seek finance for their deficits. And the big issue with global imbalances is simply that, well, while deficit countries must seek finance, surplus countries are under no such pressure to lend out their surpluses. They may only do so at an extortionate or a very high interest rates, or they may simply prefer to hold on to their surpluses for precautionary reasons or for whatever reason there is. So that asymmetry of adjustment is one of the particular problems of global imbalances. Deficit countries must seek finance, surplus countries don't really have to do anything if they don't want to. Okay, so why are global imbalances, how have they exploded and become such a prominent issue, especially before the last financial crisis? Well, here we see the link to the last video insofar as we see that those export-led countries tend to be the surplus countries and the debt-led countries tend to be the deficit countries. And so the rising inequality that we've been exploring in this course overall, it always comes back to this issue, has hindered the generation of domestic demand, meaning that growth must either be fueled by the external sector, by attracting consumers abroad, so exporting, or it must be fueled by creating debts. So as we went into in the previous video, the previous lecture. A very interesting point that was made by Thomas Pally, which is in this week's reading that we'll be discussing on Thursday, is that globalization, and in particular, the rise of these global production chains where multinational enterprises manage the construction of goods and services over a network, over countries and various places. So this is important because the offshoring and outsourcing of production means that some, industrialized countries that now have higher wages will be importing products that they once produced within their own borders, right? So if you imagine the US, a highly industrialized country, but over the last few decades, its major corporations have been locating production in Mexico and in China and so on. And so the US ends up importing goods that it used to simply produce itself and in fact exports. So that's definitely one structural driver that is important to consider. Lastly, and again peculiar to America, we have the fact that the US dollar is the world reserve currency, the de facto world reserve currency. And so long as people consider the US dollar to be the world's safest asset, the most liquid asset, the one that is most likely to retain its value over time, then there will simply be demand for US dollar cash reserves. If you are, in Thailand and the baht is not holding its currency very well, then you may want to hold on to US dollar instead. And even as a private citizen or as a corporation or as a central bank for various reasons, in order to maintain the value of your savings. So this is a big reason why the US is able to finance its deficits, simply because there is demand for the dollars that they print. Okay, so that's how we've gotten to the situation. Notice that if, for whatever reason, the American economy is considered simply too weak to support the perceived notion of value of its currency in the future, then this could really lead to a massive crisis of confidence where the US dollar is no longer considered as safe as it once was, and the resulting implosion of the world economy, right? So it's really dependent on perceptions of the safety of the US dollar. So for the reasons we have considered, namely the potential slowdown of the economy caused by global imbalances and the clear risks to stability, let's consider now some policy implications. And in particular, I want to spend a little bit of time at the end just discussing the Keynes plan. Okay, so some of the solutions don't need much time or attention because they are largely related to what's gone before in this course. So if inequality is one of the reasons that people, that economies are essentially resorting to these export-led and debt-led growth strategies, then well, measures to restore the wage share and, level equality, improve equality, can boost domestic demand and therefore lead to more sustainable domestic demand generation. Financial re-regulation is also clearly important in order to minimize the risk of debt-fueled consumption or financing non-capacity creating investment. But here we will add something new into our consideration, and that is the possibility of international coordination. So if you can implement some kind of surplus recycling system such that deficit countries like the US cannot run deficits for too long, and countries like Germany and Japan cannot run surpluses for too long, then you have essentially, clearly dealt with the problem. And this is what John Maynard Keynes' plan in 1941 was all about. How did it work? Or what was the proposal? Well, first of all, the idea was to establish a kind of central bank for the world, dubbed the International Clearing Bank or International Clearing Union. And at this world central bank, you would have a unit of account, a kind of reserve currency that Keynes called Bancor. Why was it called Bancor? Because it's the French for bank gold, Bancor. Okay, within the ICB, then you would establish fixed exchange rates with the Bancor. So between every particular member nation currency and the Bancor, you would have a fixed exchange rate. Why fixed? Well, this is typical of Keynesian thinking. Fixed exchange rates reduce uncertainty when it comes to trade, and therefore firms engaged in international trade have more certainty about the prices they will receive in a few months' time and so on, and they can plan more effectively, and therefore trade will increase under a fixed exchange rate system. At least that's the thinking, because it reduces that uncertainty which may inhibit certain decisions regarding investment and production. Okay. And then this next step is to say, well, member nations within the ICB pay a membership quota, which is in proportion to the total amount of trade in the 5 or 10 years previous to their entry into the ICB. So surplus countries would receive Bancor credits, and, well, deficit countries would have a negative, they would owe Bancor, they would have a negative account. And what's the innovation here? Well, it comes in the adjustment mechanism that Keynes was proposing. So, first of all, if a deficit country runs a deficit that is too high or goes on for too long, then they must devalue their currency against Bancor. So essentially, they must change their exchange rates such that, well, if they devalue their currency, then they will not be able to import as much so cheaply. Or, on the other hand, their exports will become more competitive to other countries, and therefore their net exports must rise. On the other hand, if there's a surplus country that's running a surplus in its current account that is considered too high, then it must revalue its currency such that its exports become less price competitive. So it's just a mirror image, essentially. The second, and this is perhaps the key, well, they're all quite important, but this is quite a key sort of innovation, is to say that, yes, excessive deficits are charged higher rates of interest, and that's kind of already taking place, you could say, in the world economy. Deficit countries must finance their deficits, and they are charged an interest rate of some sort in order to do so. But of course, surpluses you can just hold on to and not necessarily be charged for holding on to surpluses. And that's the real difference now in the Keynes plan, is to say, well, if you hold on to your surpluses and do nothing with them and don't lend them out at affordable interest rates, we will take them from you. The ICB will take the surpluses from you. They're essentially taxed at a higher rate of interest once they exceed, a certain multiple of the quota that was agreed as they enter the ICB. More than that, if you have a credit balance that exceeds the quota at the end of the financial year, the overshoot, so the amounts of your surpluses over your quota, are simply confiscated and put in a reserve fund. And so the very fact that these excess surpluses are under pressure and are recycled back into the system, it makes financing deficits easier and cheaper, and it makes that adjustment process. It makes it such that the deficit country is no longer just the only economy having to adjust. Also, the surplus countries must adjust under the Keynes plan. Okay. But the whole idea of Keynes's plan was not that he wanted all these things to be in effect all the time, but simply that the very existence of these mechanisms would mean that countries would not even have any incentive to exceed the quota or the limits imposed by the ICB. Of course, the Keynes plan is not in effect. It was not in effect, and it's still not in effect. And a good question is why, and this is what I'll just finish on now. And of course, when a good economic idea doesn't come to fruition, you must think about the politics of the idea, and that's what we'll just do on this last slide here. So the US vetoed Keynes' plan in 1941, I believe, and instead, of course, we have the Bretton Woods system, which was established. And although it did have a fixed exchange rates system, and of course the IMF was then established in order to try and help if a deficit country runs into balance of payments crises, it did not have any punishment for excess surpluses. There was no mechanism within Bretton Woods that meant that excess surpluses were somehow recycled, brought back into the monetary system. And that, you could say, was one of the main failures of the Bretton Woods system. And this is, I think, Skidelsky, who's writing or quoting the original arguments from the US. And to keep in mind the important points that the US was a surplus nation at the time. It was arguing at the time, well, its hard-earned surpluses would be at the disposal of profligate debtors. So, kind of reckless or immoral debtors. So it's this sort of plan is infused with moral elements of, well, the debtors, those who are running deficits, do so because they are reckless with their finances. And therefore, it's only right that that surplus countries that are so virtuous should be rewarded, and debtor countries should be, in some sense, punished. But, of course, the important economic point to keep in mind that was relevant then as it is today is that you cannot have so-called virtuous surpluses without so-called profligate deficits. You can't have a surplus without a deficit. It's as simple as that. So to say that, to imbue surpluses with some kind of notion of morality, or as it often is, and deficits with some notion of profligacy is problematic from an economic standpoint, especially if your aim is simply to maximize, to optimize or enhance world growth by reducing the total amount of leakages from the monetary system. And of course, this is very relevant even in recent times. We're going to speak about this more perhaps in next week with the financial crisis and the Great Recession. But the sort of political economy aspects of trying to save the Eurozone after the Greek crisis and the sovereign debt crisis and so on, in the Netherlands and in Germany and perhaps elsewhere, the narrative in politics was very much, well, the Greeks, were reckless with their spending, and therefore, of course, we shouldn't be spending more to help them because that's just, they don't deserve it in some sense. So this old political economy aspect is still extremely relevant today in explaining why such a plan as Keynes does not come in to fruition. Okay, so that's it for this video on global imbalances and Keynes's plan on how to deal with them. Perhaps I'll just mention as a last point that since the financial crisis, a version of Keynes' plan has come back into the limelight where the special drawing rights at the IMF are used in place of Bancor as this sort of currency, and there are amendments to the sort of function of the IMF to be able to achieve Keynes' plan or a version of it. So it's still very much a relevant idea that seems to kind of come back into popularity as time goes by. And perhaps after this corona crisis, it will, well, increase again in its popularity and visibility. So who knows? Hopefully this idea hasn't been completely forgotten, because it definitely has its merits. But we can discuss that on Thursday when you tell me what you think about everything you've seen in this video and the one prior. And of course, we'll be discussing Tom Palley's paper on the causes of global imbalances. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you all on Thursday.